Welcome to Fear Spiral, where the darkest highways, abandoned places, and chilling encounters come alive. Buckle up, listen closely, and don't look back. If you dare to face the terror, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a story. The man at my window. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. It wasn't the type of place where people worried about locking their doors or looking over their shoulders when walking home at night. Everyone knew everyone. The most exciting thing that ever happened in our area was the occasional raccoon tipping over trash cans. But one night when I was 17, everything changed for me. It was late September, a Friday night, and I was home alone. My parents had gone out to dinner about an hour away, and my younger sister was sleeping over at a friend's house. I didn't mind. I actually liked having the house to myself sometimes. I remember it was around 11:45 p.m. when I turned off the TV in the living room and decided to head upstairs to my room. Our house had these big sliding glass doors in the kitchen that opened to the backyard. They were always covered with vertical blinds, but that night I noticed one of the slats was bent, leaving a thin gap where you could see outside. As I walked past, I had this strange prickling sensation that made me stop. I don't even know why, but something in me told me to look. Through that little gap in the blinds, I could see part of the backyard, and that's when I noticed a faint shape near the edge of the lawn, standing very still. At first, I thought maybe it was the neighbor's tree casting a weird shadow, but then I realized it was the silhouette of a man. My stomach dropped instantly. He wasn't moving, just standing there facing the house. I froze for a good 10 seconds, my heart hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. I slowly backed away from the glass door, not wanting whoever it was to know I'd seen him. Trying to stay calm, I grabbed my phone and went upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. I remember pacing back and forth, trying to decide if I should call my parents or the police. Part of me wondered if I'd just imagined it, but when I looked out my bedroom window, which overlooked the backyard, my fear was confirmed. The man was still there. It was dark, but I could make out details under the faint glow of the streetlight spilling over from the front yard. He was tall, definitely over 6 feet, and wearing some kind of dark hoodie. His face was shadowed, but his posture was strange, stiff, almost deliberate. He wasn't walking around or trying to hide. He was just watching. Around 12:15 a.m. I heard it, a soft tapping. I held my breath, straining my ears, and realized it was coming from downstairs. The glass door. I felt my whole body go cold. He was tapping on it, slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. I whispered to myself, "What the hell do I do?" I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. Finally, I dialed 911 with shaking hands and told the operator there was a man outside my house watching me. She told me to stay on the line and stay hidden until officers arrived. Minutes stretched like hours. I sat on the floor with my back against my bed, clutching the phone so tight my knuckles hurt. Then the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe he had left, but then I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of footsteps on the deck right outside my window. I didn't want to look, but some twisted part of me had to know. I slowly turned my head toward the window, and my heart nearly stopped. He was right there, standing on the deck, his face inches from the glass. The blinds were thin, and through the slats I could see the pale shape of his face pressed close. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't making any expression at all. Just staring. I ducked down instantly, whispering frantically into the phone, "He's at my window, he's right here." The dispatcher told me to stay quiet, that police were on their way. But I could hear him, his breathing, the faint squeak of his shoes as he shifted his weight. He was so close I felt like he could hear my heart pounding. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. I didn't hear him walk away. I didn't hear the deck creak. Nothing. I waited, trembling, until finally I saw the flashing red and blue lights through the front curtains. When the officers arrived, they searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no one. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. One of the cops tried to reassure me, saying maybe it was just some drunk guy who wandered off before they got there. But I know what I saw. My parents got home shortly after, and though they tried to comfort me, I couldn't shake the image of that face at my window. I barely slept that night. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every sound. I kept my blinds shut tight, and I avoided being home alone at night whenever possible. The strangest part? About 3 months later, We heard that a house 2 streets over had been broken into while the family was sleeping inside. No one was hurt, but the thought has haunted me ever since. Was it the same man? Was he testing our house that night, watching, waiting? I'll never know for sure, but sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the blinds are drawn, I swear I still feel eyes on me from the darkness outside. The knock at the door had happened in the winter of 2019, when I was living alone for the first time. I had just graduated from college and moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. The building itself was old, built in the late 1960s, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear muffled conversations from the units beside me. Still, it was affordable, and for a 22-year-old trying to make ends meet, that was all that mattered. It was early February, one of those nights where the temperature had dropped below freezing. The kind where your breath fogs up instantly when you step outside. I had been working late shifts at my new job and usually got home around 11:30. That night, though, I left earlier, around 9:45, because the weather was supposed to get worse. By the time I made it home and settled in, it was about 10:15 p.m. I remember putting on sweatpants, making some ramen, and sitting on the couch to watch TV. The building was usually quiet by that time of night. A few of the tenants were older, retired folks, and most of the younger ones kept to themselves. I rarely heard people in the hallways. That's why when I heard a knock at my door around 10:45, I immediately froze. It wasn't just a casual knock either. It was slow, heavy, 3 deliberate knocks. I muted the TV, my eyes fixed on the door. My first thought was maybe it was a neighbor in trouble, but something about it didn't feel right. I didn't move at first, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But a few seconds later, the knocks came again. I finally stood up and crept toward the door, my socks muffling my steps against the wooden floor. I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. What I saw made my stomach twist. There was a man standing there. He was wearing a long, dark coat and his head was lowered so I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't carrying anything, not like a package or groceries, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. I didn't recognize him, and I'd lived in that building long enough to know most of the tenants by sight. I whispered to myself, "What the hell?" and stepped back. That's when I heard it, his voice, low, almost too quiet to hear through the door. "Can you let me in?" Every instinct in me screamed no. I didn't respond. I didn't move. After maybe 20 seconds of silence, there were 3 more knocks, louder this time. I backed further into my apartment, grabbing my phone from the coffee table. I considered calling 911, but part of me thought maybe he was just some lost guy who had the wrong door. So I called the building manager instead. He didn't answer, so I left a shaky voicemail. Meanwhile, I went back to the peephole, and that's when I realized the man had moved closer. His face was tilted upward now, and I could see more clearly under the dim hallway light. He was pale, maybe mid-40s, with these dark, sunken eyes that looked straight into the peephole like he knew I was watching. My heart raced. I stumbled backward, knocking into my coffee table. The sound must have given me away because he whispered again, louder this time. "I know you're in there. Just open the door." I can't explain the fear I felt in that moment. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator what was happening. She told me to stay quiet, stay inside, and that officers were on their way. While I was on the call, the man at the door didn't leave. He didn't pound or shout. He just stood there, occasionally whispering through the door things like, "Come on, it's cold out here," or "Just for a minute." The way he said it, it wasn't pleading. It was calm, almost rehearsed. I remember looking at the clock. It was 11:08 p.m. and thinking how slowly time was passing. Every sound in that moment was magnified. The faint hum of the refrigerator, my shallow breathing, the blood rushing in my ears. Then suddenly silence. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute, nothing. I went back to the peephole cautiously and he was gone. Relief washed over me for just a second before I noticed something that made my knees nearly give out. He hadn't left. He was crouching just below the peephole, out of sight. When I leaned forward, his face suddenly shot upward into view. He was grinning. His teeth looked yellow in the dim light and his eyes were wide, unblinking. I stumbled back so fast I almost tripped. I whispered to the dispatcher, "He's still here. Oh my God, he's right at the door." She reassured me that the police were on their way, but it felt like forever. The knocking started again, but this time it was frantic. Rapid pounding, rattling the door on its hinges. I backed into my bedroom and locked myself inside, clutching the phone like it was the only thing keeping me alive. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Dead silence. When the police finally arrived around 11:20 p.m., they found no one in the hallway. They checked the security cameras at the front and back entrances of the building, but strangely there was no footage of the man entering or leaving. It was as if he never existed. I barely slept that night, and for weeks after I'd wake up at the smallest sound, staring at my front door, waiting for those knocks to return. They never did, but I'll never forget his face grinning into that peephole like he was already inside. And sometimes when I'm walking alone at night, I get this horrible feeling that he's still out there somewhere waiting for another door to knock on. The Highway Stalker. I was 19 when this happened. At the time, I was a college sophomore, and I often drove home on weekends to visit my parents. They lived about 2 hours away from my campus in upstate New York, so the drive wasn't too bad. Mostly long stretches of rural highway with the occasional gas station or diner along the way. It was late October. The air had that cold, sharp bite of fall, and the trees lining the highway were half bare, their branches like black skeletons against the night sky. I remember the exact time because I had just glanced at the glowing digits on my dashboard clock. It was 2:37 a.m. I had stayed way too late at a friend's dorm party and decided to just drive home instead of crashing there. I thought the empty roads would be peaceful. I was wrong. The first time I noticed the car was about 20 minutes into my drive. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think anything of it. Cars come and go. But after several minutes I realized the vehicle wasn't passing me, even though the road was empty for miles. It just stayed behind me, keeping a consistent distance. I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were heading the same way. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the unease building in my stomach. To test it, I sped up a little. The car sped up too. I slowed down. They slowed down. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself, don't panic, just stay calm. But my heart was already racing, my palms slick with sweat. The car's headlights glared in my mirror, almost blinding, making me feel like I was being examined, hunted. At around 2:55 a.m., I decided to take the next exit, a small road that curved into a wooded area where a 24-hour gas station stood. I figured if I pulled in there, the driver would either continue on their way or I'd be around people just in case. I put on my blinker and took the exit. Sure enough, the car followed. By the time I pulled into the gas station, the place looked deserted. Just a couple of dimly lit pumps and a flickering sign above the convenience store. No other cars, no clerk visible through the glass doors. My stomach sank. I parked near the front and pretended to check my phone, glancing up through the windshield. The other car, a dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue, pulled in too. It didn't stop at a pump. It didn't park in front of the store. It just idled at the far end of the lot, its headlights still on, pointing directly at me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself maybe it was just a coincidence. But then, after about 30 seconds, the car slowly started rolling closer. My chest tightened. My gut screamed at me to leave. I threw my car into reverse, then shifted into drive, peeling out of the lot and back onto the highway. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd overreacted. But when I glanced in the mirror, the sedan was right behind me again. Its headlights loomed closer this time. I pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing. My little Corolla wasn't built for racing, but adrenaline gave me courage. The road stretched on endlessly, the dark trees blurring at the edges of my vision. The sedan matched my speed easily, sticking close enough that I could almost make out the silhouette of the driver through the glare. Around 3:10 a.m., I came to a long stretch of highway with no exits, no towns, nothing but trees. That's when the sedan did something that still chills me to this day. It swerved suddenly into the opposite lane, sped up until it was right next to me, and then the driver rolled down their window. I forced myself to glance over for just a second. I'll never forget what I saw. A man, maybe in his late 30s or 40s, pale face illuminated by his dashboard lights. He wasn't smiling or yelling. He was just staring at me, eyes wide open, unblinking, like he was studying me. I slammed the accelerator, heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. My car rattled as I pushed it faster than I ever had. The sedan stayed beside me for a few terrifying seconds, the man's gaze locked on mine, before suddenly dropping back behind me again. I didn't know what to do. Calling 911 crossed my mind, but I was in the middle of nowhere, and I wasn't sure how long it would take help to arrive. My only option was to make it to the next town as fast as I could. The next 20 minutes were a blur of panic. The sedan followed me relentlessly, sometimes pulling close, sometimes hanging back, but never leaving. My throat was dry, my hands numb from gripping the wheel so tightly. Every shadow on the road looked like a threat. Finally, around 3:35 a.m., I saw the glowing lights of a truck stop ahead. I pulled off the highway and into the brightly lit lot, parking right in front of the entrance where several semis were parked. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I jumped out of my car and ran inside. The clerk looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I didn't even try to explain at first. I just stood there, trying to catch my breath, eyes darting toward the windows. A few minutes later, I saw the sedan drive past slowly on the road, but it didn't pull in. It just kept going, disappearing into the night. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the car was long gone. They took my statement and told me it was probably just someone messing with me. But I know what I felt. That man wasn't messing around. He wasn't trying to scare me for fun. The way he looked at me, it was like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. I made it home safely around 4:30 a.m., but that drive scarred me. To this day, I hate being on the highway alone at night. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror makes my heart race. And sometimes, when I'm driving late, I swear I see that same dark sedan trailing me, keeping its distance, waiting for me to notice. The stranger in the motel hallway back in 2021, I was on a solo road trip across the Midwest. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Just drive, see the countryside, stay in cheap motels along the way. I had mapped out most of my route, but I didn't book lodging in advance. My plan was to stop whenever I got tired and find a place for the night. On the third night of the trip, I ended up in a small town in Indiana. It was around 11:20 p.m. when I decided to call it quits for the day. The town wasn't much to look at, just a main street with a few shops and gas stations, and off the highway, a rundown-looking motel with a flickering neon sign that said Rest Haven. It wasn't my first choice, but I was exhausted and I figured it would do for one night. The lobby smelled faintly of cigarettes and mildew. The clerk behind the counter barely looked at me as he slid a clipboard forward for me to sign. He handed me an old-fashioned metal key with the number 207 etched into it. I carried my overnight bag up the creaky stairs, the faded carpet crunching under my shoes. Room 207 wasn't great. Stained curtains, buzzing fluorescent light, bedspread that looked older than me. But it was a place to sleep. I locked the door, double-checked the bolt, and settled in. I remember lying in bed scrolling my phone for a while, the hum of the heater filling the silence. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy and I drifted off. I woke up sometime later to a noise. It was faint at first, like the sound of footsteps. I groggily checked the time on my phone. 2:46 a.m. The footsteps grew clearer, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallway outside my room. At first I assumed it was another guest coming back late. But the steps stopped right outside my door. I lay there frozen, my ears straining. Then came a soft scraping sound like fingers brushing against the door. I sat up in bed, my pulse spiking. I whispered to myself, "What the hell?" The scraping stopped. For a few seconds there was silence. Then 3 slow knocks, my heart skipped. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocks came again, louder this time. I whispered, "Who's there?" before I could even think. Silence. I slid off the bed as quietly as I could and tiptoed toward the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole. What I saw made my stomach lurch. There was a man standing there. He wasn't dressed like a motel guest. He was tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old, oversized coat. His head was tilted down so I couldn't see his face clearly, but his hair was long and stringy, hanging around his shoulders. He was just standing there, not knocking anymore, not moving. I backed away immediately, trying to stay calm. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. The line rang, but no one answered. I whispered, "Come on, pick up, pick up." But there was nothing. I went back to the door and looked again, and this time the man's head was tilted upward. His face was right in line with the peephole, staring directly into it. His eyes looked wide and glassy, his mouth slightly open like he was caught mid-breath. I jumped back, nearly dropping my phone. My chest heaved as panic surged through me. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling 911, but part of me was terrified of making noise. Then came the sound that made me want to crawl out of my skin. The doorknob rattled. Slowly at first, then harder, like he was testing it. I whispered under my breath, "Please, God, no." I staggered back toward the bed, clutching my phone. That's when I remembered the window. I hurried over and peeled back the curtain just enough to look outside. The parking lot below was empty except for my car and a couple of others. The drop wasn't far, maybe 8 feet. I thought, if he gets in, I'll jump. The rattling stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps. Only this time they were moving away from my door. I held my breath, listening as they faded down the hallway. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, before finally working up the courage to check the peephole again. The hallway was empty. I barely slept after that. I sat in the chair by the window until dawn, my heart racing at every creak of the building. When I checked out later that morning, I told the clerk what had happened. He looked at me with a blank expression and said, "We didn't have anyone on this floor last night except you." I wanted to argue, but the dead look in his eyes made my blood run cold. I just grabbed my bag and left without another word. Even now, years later, I can still see that pale face staring back at me through the peephole. And sometimes I wonder, if I hadn't locked the door, would he have come in? The shadow outside my dorm window. This happened during my freshman year of college in the fall of 2017. I went to a small university in the Midwest, and my dorm was in one of the older buildings on campus. It was 4 stories tall, brick exterior, squeaky stairwells, and drafty windows that whistled when the wind blew. My room was on the 3rd floor, facing a small patch of woods that separated the dorms from a parking lot. Most nights were loud with music and people hanging out in the hallways, but this particular night was strangely quiet. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I had the whole room to myself. I remember it was a Friday and I was up late, studying and scrolling on my laptop at the same time. When I finally glanced at the clock, it was 2:12 a.m. The only sounds were the hum of the radiator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. That's when I heard something outside my window. At first it was faint, like a crunch of leaves, the sound carrying faintly through the glass. I paused, tilting my head. Then I heard it again. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the blinds back just a little. The trees below swayed in the wind, shadows shifting across the dimly lit lot. I didn't see anything, so I let the blinds fall back into place and told myself I was just being jumpy. A few minutes later, there was another sound. This time it was unmistakable. A tap on the glass. My stomach sank. 3rd floor. No balcony, no ledge. No reason anyone should be tapping on my window. I froze, staring at the blinds. My mind scrambled for explanations, maybe a branch? But I knew those trees didn't reach this high. The tapping came again, louder this time, deliberate. I whispered out loud, "What the hell?" I forced myself to look. I pulled the blinds just enough to peek outside, and my heart nearly stopped. There was a face at the window. It was pale, pressed against the glass from the outside, eyes wide open, staring directly at me. The features were blurred by the reflection of my desk lamp, but I could see the outline of a mouth, slightly open, like it was whispering something I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, my breath caught in my throat. I whispered to myself, "No, no, no, no." When I dared to look again, the face was gone. The window was just glass, reflecting the dim glow of my room. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, but then I noticed something that made my stomach twist even harder. A faint smudge on the outside of the glass, like condensation from someone's breath. I grabbed my phone and called campus security. My voice trembled as I explained what had happened. The officer on the line told me to stay in my room and lock the door, that someone would come by to check the area. Minutes dragged by. I sat on the edge of my bed clutching my phone, eyes darting to the window every few seconds. The building was dead silent, so every sound was amplified, the radiator clicking, footsteps echoing faintly down the hall. Around 2:30 a.m. I heard it again. This time not a tap. A scraping sound like nails dragging across the glass. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My whole body was shaking. The scraping lasted maybe 5 seconds before stopping. Then silence again. I didn't dare move. Finally, after what felt like forever, there was a knock at my door. I jumped so hard I almost dropped my phone. The voice on the other side said, "Campus security." "You called about a disturbance?" I hesitated, my mind racing. What if it wasn't them? What if it was whoever or whatever was at my window? I forced myself to call the campus security number again, and when the dispatcher confirmed they had an officer outside my door, I finally opened it. The officer checked the room, then went outside to look around the building. He came back up a few minutes later and said, "There's no way anyone was at your window. You're on the 3rd floor. No ladder, no footprints, nothing." I wanted to argue, but the words caught in my throat. I knew what I had seen. I knew about the smudge on the glass. For the rest of the semester, I kept my blinds shut tight every night. But sometimes, even through the fabric, I swore I could hear faint tapping. And once, just once, I woke up in the dead of night to see the blinds gently swaying, like someone had brushed against them from the outside. I never looked again. The thing that followed me home. This happened 3 years ago in the summer of 2020. At the time, I was living in a small rental house just outside of Portland, Oregon. I worked late shifts at a coffee shop downtown and usually drove home well after midnight. It was only a 20-minute drive, mostly along quiet suburban roads lined with trees and dim streetlights. One night in late July, my manager asked if I could stay late to clean after a machine broke down. I didn't leave work until 2:05 a.m. By the time I got in my car, the streets were nearly empty. The sky had that washed-out gray look it gets before dawn, but it was still dark enough to make the world feel empty. As I drove, I felt that strange, prickling sensation you get sometimes when you know someone's watching you. It started at the base of my neck and crawled down my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. I turned up the radio to shake the feeling off. About 10 minutes from home, I reached a particularly dark stretch of road that ran parallel to a wooded park. There weren't any houses for a quarter mile, just trees and the faint glow of my headlights bouncing off the asphalt. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer, something pale moving at the tree line. But as my car drew closer, my stomach clenched. It wasn't a deer. It was a figure. A tall, thin figure, almost too thin, standing just off the road. Its skin, if that's what it was, looked pale and gray under the headlights. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle like it didn't have a neck. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. Instinctively, I pressed the gas pedal, flying past it. In my side mirror, I saw it step closer to the road like it had been waiting for me. I told myself over and over, it was a trick of the light. Just a tree. Just a tree. But a minute later, when I glanced in the mirror again, my blood turned cold. Something was in the road behind me. It wasn't a car. It wasn't an animal. It was that same pale shape, now directly in the center of the lane, growing smaller as I sped away but somehow still clear enough to see. It wasn't moving like a person would run. It was almost gliding. My hands were slick with sweat. My mouth went dry. "No, no, no," I whispered. I hit 65 on a 45 Mayfair road, blowing past a stop sign just to put distance between me and that thing. I didn't look in the mirror again until I was a block from my house. When I did, the road behind me was empty. I pulled into my driveway, heart hammering. My little house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall hedges. Normally, it felt cozy. That night, it felt like a trap. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Then I got out, locked the car, and practically sprinted to my front door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The moment I got inside, I locked every door and window, then went to the front window to peek out through the blinds. Nothing. The street was still, the hedges swaying gently in the breeze. I tried to calm myself, telling myself again it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tap at the front window. I froze. Another tap. My heart felt like it stopped. I forced myself to look. Through the narrow gap in the blinds, I saw something pale standing just beyond the hedges. Too tall to be a person, its head tilted the same unnatural way. Even in the darkness, I could see it wasn't blinking. It was just watching. I stumbled backward, grabbing my phone. My fingers shook so badly I nearly dropped it. I called 911 and whispered to the dispatcher that someone, or something, was outside my house. She told me to stay on the line and stay where I was until officers arrived. The tapping stopped. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then from the back of the house I heard the faint sound of my back gate creaking open. I think I whispered, "Oh my God," about 10 times. The dispatcher kept talking to me, trying to keep me calm, but I could barely hear her over the blood rushing in my ears. And then, silence again. When the police finally arrived at 2:37 a.m., they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the hedges. They told me it was probably an animal and suggested I get motion sensor lights. But I know what I saw, and ever since that night, I've had the same nightmare over and over. Me driving down that dark road, glancing in the mirror and seeing that pale figure gliding closer, always closer. I haven't driven that route home again. And some nights, when the wind moves just right through the hedges outside, I swear I hear faint tapping at the window. The voice under the floorboards. In the winter of 2018, I was renting a tiny, creaky house in northern Vermont. It was the cheapest thing I could find while saving up for grad school. The place had been built sometime in the 1940s, the landlord told me, and it showed: old pipes, warped wooden floors, and a basement that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It was January. Snow piled high against the windows, nights long and silent. My roommate had gone back to Boston for a week to visit family, leaving me alone in the house. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet even when the wind howled outside. On the second night alone, I stayed up late reading on the couch. It was 2:18 a.m. when I finally decided to go to bed. I turned off the lamp, the room sinking into darkness except for the faint blue glow of the streetlight outside. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard it, a faint sound beneath the floor. At first I thought it was just the old pipes knocking, but then I froze mid-step. It wasn't pipes. It was a voice. It was low, muffled, like someone whispering through the floorboards. I held my breath, straining to hear. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but it had a rhythm, like someone murmuring a sentence over and over. I tried to tell myself it was just the house creaking, but as I reached the top of the stairs, the voice grew louder. My bedroom was directly above the basement. I whispered to myself, "You're just tired. You're hearing things." But the moment I said it, the voice stopped, as if it had heard me. My skin prickled. I hurried into my room and shut the door, locking it even though it wouldn't do much. I climbed into bed fully clothed, my ears straining. At 2:30 a.m., the whispering started again. Louder this time, directly under my bed. I sat up, heart hammering. This time I could almost make out the words. It sounded like, "Let me out. Let me out." I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking slightly. "No, no, no," I whispered. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A scraping from below, like fingernails dragging across wood. It started directly beneath me and moved slowly toward the far corner of the room. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice shook as I told the dispatcher someone might be in my basement. She told me to stay in my room, stay on the line, and wait for officers. The scraping stopped. Silence, then suddenly, 3 hard knocks from directly below my floor. I gasped so loud the dispatcher asked if I was okay. I whispered, "Someone's under my floor. They're knocking." I sat frozen, clutching the phone, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The knocks came again, and again, slow and deliberate. I could hear the dispatcher saying something, but her voice felt far away. All I could focus on was the sound of those knocks, closer now, like they were following me, and then silence again. When the police finally arrived at 2:52 a.m., I ran downstairs to let them in. They searched the basement thoroughly. Nothing. Just old boxes, cobwebs, and the smell of damp wood. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. No place anyone could hide. One of the officers even knocked on the floor to show me how sound travels in old houses. He tried to reassure me, but his eyes had that uneasy look, like he wasn't entirely convinced himself. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my car until sunrise. When my roommate came back a few days later, I told her everything. She went pale and said, "You know, the landlord told me once someone died down there years ago. I moved out a week later. But sometimes when I'm in a quiet house at night, I swear I can hear that same muffled voice beneath the floorboards whispering to be let out." The visitor at the back door. This happened in the fall of 2021 when I was renting a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood in western Pennsylvania. I had just gone through a breakup and was living alone for the first time in years. My house backed up to a wooded lot with no streetlights, just a black tangle of trees that pressed right up against my backyard. Most nights, I was in bed by 11. But on this night, I had stayed up watching a documentary, scrolling on my phone. When I glanced at the clock, it was 2:07 a.m. I decided to call it a night and got up to turn off the living room lights. As I walked toward the kitchen to grab a glass of water, I noticed something strange. The motion light above the back door was on. It only came on when something moved near the door or the small deck behind the house. I froze in the dark kitchen listening. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I moved quietly to the window over the sink and peeked out through the blinds. The yard was bathed in the pale glow of the motion light. The trees beyond were a wall of black. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw movement near the edge of the deck. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the light. I couldn't make out details, only the outline of a tall figure. Perfectly still, I whispered, "Hello?" Before I even thought about it, the figure didn't answer. It didn't move. I backed away from the window, my heart thudding. My first instinct was to lock the back door, even though I knew it was already locked. My hands shook as I slid the deadbolt just to be sure. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was outside my back door. She told me to stay inside and stay on the line. I could hear her voice in my ear, calm and even, but my focus was on the sound coming from the deck. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden boards moving toward the door. I clamped a hand over my mouth, backing into the hallway. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, like a polite tap, then again a little harder. 3 slow knocks, I whispered to the dispatcher. "They're knocking. Someone's knocking." The knocking stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then from just outside the door a voice, low, almost a whisper, "Let me in." I froze. The dispatcher was asking me if I could see the person, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I could hear the voice again, this time closer, right against the door. "It's cold out here. Let me in." It wasn't a normal tone. It was flat, like someone imitating speech without inflection. I whispered, "Go away." "I'm calling the police." Silence. Then the doorknob rattled, slowly at first, then violently, like someone trying to force it. I backed all the way into my bedroom and locked the door, still on the phone with the dispatcher. She told me officers were on their way. The rattling stopped. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no voice. Just the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the dispatcher's voice in my ear. When the police arrived at 2:29 a.m., they found no one. No footprints in the wet leaves, no sign of forced entry. They checked the woods with flashlights but came back shaking their heads. One of the officers told me it was probably a prank. But I could tell by the way he kept glancing at the tree line that he didn't quite believe that either. I installed extra locks and cameras the next day. The cameras have never caught anything. But sometimes, very late at night, my back motion light will flick on for no reason, and every time it does, I can almost hear that flat, cold voice at my back door. "It's cold out here. Let me in."